Good evening. I would like to welcome you to the Krasno Global Event Series. It's wonderful to see you again. Thank you for joining us today for our session on the world in 2021. It is a great pleasure to welcome our special guest today, the Honorable Bob Carr, who joins us from Sydney in Australia. And apparently it is very hot in Australia, and Bob is able to look out onto some nice beaches. Unfortunately, right now, we don't seem to have that here in Chapel Hill. I notice people from Germany, from Britain, from China who have joined us, and from some other countries as well. Welcome to you too. And of course, there are many people from the United States. We are still living in highly uncertain times, and Bob will enlighten us about American and Australian foreign policy, about relations with China, about climate change and the pandemic management, but also about developments in the Middle East, Europe and elsewhere. I'm sure this will be a highly enlightening event. I'm Klaus Larres. I'm the Richdam Krasno Distinguished Professor of History and International Affairs here at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I've been organizing the Krasno Global Event Series since 2012. As you know, the Krasno Global Event Series here at UNC always deals with issues of global concern. We have a great website, krasnoevents.com, and a very popular YouTube channel, youtube.com/KrasnoUNC. And please sign up for our mailing list via the website or by simply sending me an email. Tonight, I will ask Bob Carr a number of questions dealing with different topics, 6 or 7 perhaps, and then we will open it up to questions from you, the audience. As always, please submit your questions by using the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Our excellent 2 Krasno assistants today, Laurel Fright and Anna Fiore, will select the most interesting questions and read them out aloud. Please mention your name and your location when writing down a question. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to welcome you tonight to our Krasno event at UNC on the world in 2021 with the Honorable Bob Carr. Let me just introduce Bob Carr briefly. As you know, Bob Carr is a former Foreign Minister of Australia. He was a senator in the federal parliament and the long-standing premier of New South Wales and leader of the Labour Party. Bob and I go back some time. We first met in Sydney and then afterwards on several occasions in Beijing in China. And I'm very pleased that Bob found the time to join us tonight. Bob was the longest serving premier of New South Wales from 1995 to 2005. As premier, Bob Carr emphasized conservation and the environment, public-private partnerships to fund infrastructure projects, and also police reform. Bob more than doubled the number of public parks in New South Wales from 328 to over 770. Bob and his team did also much of the planning for the successful Olympics, which took place in Sydney in 2000. Let me also say that in his younger years, Bob was the first in his family to finish high school, and then he graduated from the University of New South Wales in a tremendously interesting subject. Bob Carr received a BA in history. He then first worked as a journalist before entering politics. As Minister of Foreign Affairs from 2012 to 2013, Bob focused on successfully getting Australia onto the UN Security Council. He also worked on the passage of a global arms trade treaty, on the Middle East peace process and the war in Syria. And in Syria, he focused on a medical pact to protect hospitals. Last not least, Bob Carr worked on improving Australia's complex relations with Asia, not least with China, but also with Myanmar, for example. He pushed Western countries to lift sanctions on Myanmar after the transition to democracy in 2012. Regarding China, Bob viewed China's leaders as being determined, confident and pragmatic, but he also still supported Australia's decision to block Huawei technologies from participating in the Australian National Broadband Network. Bob has also written a great and entertaining memoir about his time as foreign minister, The Diary of a Foreign Minister. And here it is. I can warmly recommend it. It really is a good read. In the recent past, Bob has worked on as an academic at various universities and also as a prolific author and writer. Bob, it's great to have you here. Thanks for joining us.
Klaus, it's a very great honor. Thank you very much.
Now, we would like to pepper you with lots of questions. and then we will open it to questions from the audience. Let me first pepper you with some questions. First of all, the Biden administration has been in office for just a few weeks, but they already have made an impression in foreign policy, I believe. What do you make of the new Biden administration? What do you think of Biden's foreign policy and his personnel?
Yeah, I think like the rest of the world, Klaus, this experience of seeing Biden assume the leadership and appoint his team, it's like seeing a friend, the familiar face of a friend, recover from a 4-year fever, return to robust, good health. It's an enormous relief. And I don't think there's an ally, a friend, or a partner of the United States who doesn't welcome the election of Biden and Biden's professionalism and a return to serious diplomacy. I'm just looking, I looked in preparation for our conversation at Biden's article in Foreign Affairs, you know, the traditional article that a candidate for the presidency will write. His appeared in March, April 2020. And there's a big paragraph in it that says diplomacy should be the first instrument of American power. He talks about landmark multilateral deals like the one to stop Iran from obtaining nuclear weapons. He extols diplomacy. And I think we're seeing him deliver on that. The fact that he's embraced American leadership on climate change, to me personally, is hugely welcome, just hugely welcome. And I get a sense of a man at 70 years of age who, in the time he's got left to him, wants to do everything to save the world from an imminent catastrophe, which would be where I'm thinking of the young people at your university listening to us now, which is where we would be if we move beyond 1.5 degrees warming by 2050.
Yeah, but he has also he also invited the Taiwanese representative in Washington, D.C. to his inauguration. And he has said that he wants to be tough on China, as tough as Trump and the Republicans in Congress want to be and were. What do you think of that? Are we heading towards conflict? Are we having maybe even military conflicts on our hands? Or what is the policy towards China the United States and its allies should pursue?
It's deeply worrying, this prospect of a U.S. China showdown, most likely over Taiwan Strait, most likely over Taiwan rather than Northeast Asia or South China Sea or anything else. I think his commitment to be tough sends a strong message about economic measures. For example, the so-called tech wars between the US and China. He won't give ground there. It's going to be very interesting to see what he does on trade, but one would expect the pressure on China over, probably most important, the Chinese subsidies for its major manufacturing corporations, Chinese subsidies to state-owned enterprises. The pressure there will be maintained. But I think one hallmark of his approach on China will be to seek areas for cooperation. Now, both Kurt Campbell and Jake Sullivan, in their Foreign Affairs article that appeared in late 2019, called Competition Without Catastrophe, how America can both challenge and coexist with China, committed what is now the Biden team to areas of cooperation that would include most prominently climate and pandemic management. So delineating areas of cooperation while maintaining the resistance to China in areas where it was quite explicit under Trump, I think that'll be the hallmark. I'll just share with you very quickly my one meeting when I was foreign minister with then Vice President Biden. It was in winter 2013 in his office in the White House. I remember the snow coming down outside the windows and the fire crackling. I remember the shine on the Federation era museum quality furniture that decorated his room. And I remember above all the charm of this very professional politician, a politician's politician, an Irish-American politician, the immense charm of Biden. And the most important subject of our conversation was China. He was proud of the fact that as vice president, he developed a relationship with China's vice president, Xi Jinping. He said, it was an interesting recollection, he said that he remembered one very long conversation where Xi Jinping had pressed him about one issue, and that was the relationship between the political and the military leadership in the United States, as if he, Xi Jinping, were preparing himself for the day when he would have supreme authority in China. And of course, that includes chairmanship of the Central Military Commission. I got the impression that Biden was going to be, should he ever become president, very confident about sitting down with the Chinese leadership and forceful. For example, I don't think he will hesitate to put pressure on the Chinese to deliver on Xi's commitment made in September last year to have net zero emissions by 2060. He'll ask them to advance that, I would think. And he'd expect them in the 14th five-year plan, which is published next month, to demonstrate there'll be no funding for new coal-fired power. And I expect he will also press the Chinese very forcefully to decarbonise the projects they're funding under the so-called Belt and Road Initiative. He will be confident about dealing with them. I think in the words of Kurt Campbell and Jake Sullivan in Foreign Affairs, he'll want competition without catastrophe. He'll be intent on both challenging and coexisting with China. There'll be far more professionalism and consistency about it. Kurt Campbell, who he's appointed to an envoy role, charged with policy in Asia, is very equipped to carry out this task. But the biggest challenge by far will be the management of relations over Taiwan.
Biden has called Xi Jinping a thug. That doesn't help in relations, does it? To go about and, well, just use these sort of terms about China. Do you think that will mean anything, or it was just rhetoric during the election campaign?
Yeah, the Chinese are very used to one thing. They've seen it. They've seen it from the 1980s. They've seen candidates for the US presidency be rhetorically very tough on China. Clinton, for example, running for the presidency in 1992, talking about the butchers of Beijing in respect of Tiananmen, which had occurred only in 1989, and then settling down in government to implement a pragmatic engagement with China. So they factor in the consideration that any candidate for the US presidency will rough them up during a presidential election campaign, and they're prepared to overlook that for the all-important commencement of work on the necessary bilateral arrangements. And that is, there'll be an openness. I think they've anticipated that President Biden will put pressure on them on climate. They've anticipated that. And I'd like to think they've anticipated that they need, with the new administration, to settle things down over Taiwan. I think the world is in a lot of trouble if both sides haven't been massaging messages to each other about the management of Taiwan.
So how do you think that will happen? So the Americans will just put pressure on Taiwan not to do anything which they shouldn't be doing in the eyes of the Chinese? Or how will that work? I mean, what kind of leeway does Biden have to influence relations between China and Taiwan?
Well, a traditional American diplomatic posture has been to restrain any impulse toward a declaration of independence in Taiwan. One of the diplomatic achievements of the George W. Bush administration was to use their presence in Taipei to do precisely that. So that's a traditional American position. America has departed from it under Trump by seeming to deliver things for Taiwanese leadership. Although some people who've analysed what has actually happened, at least until the lame duck period when Pompeo drifted a bit further, some American diplomats have argued that in fact Trump had done nothing on Taiwan that lacked a precedent in Taiwanese U.S. China relations. So I've got reasonable confidence that Kurt Campbell, taking responsibility for this in the Biden diplomatic lineup, will know what strings to pull to see that the Taiwanese don't cross any crucial red line. And I'd like to think that in Beijing, there's a similar sensitivity and a desire to move back measurably from what appears to be the position we've drifted into during the lame duck period when Pompeo appeared to push the boundaries somewhat.
Mm-hmm. And what about the South China Sea? Here, China is really adamant that the 9-dash line, the so-called 9-dash line, it's 90% of the South China Sea essentially, is sovereign Chinese territory, and that no one else is meant to dispute that American ships should ask for permission if they were going through it, that also the other countries interested or which claim to have rights to the islands and reefs and rocks of the South China Sea, some of them uninhabited, but that all is disputed by China. So how can the United States convince the Chinese to maybe stick to the 2016 The Hague judgment?
I think we need to separate out issues here. Let's take the 9-dash lines. Mm-hmm. It's a map that indicates a traditional Chinese position. It goes back to before 1949. It goes back to Chiang Kai-shek's rule of China. A traditional Chinese position that casts a net of sovereignty over that whole area of the South China Sea. China's never defined what that means. Does it simply mean the right to the mineral resources under the sea? Does it mean a right to sovereignty over all land features? They've never defined that. A more immediate issue is what Chinese sovereignty means over the artificial structures they've built in the South China Sea. So they've taken a shoal or a cay, they've engaged in landfill, and then they've built a structure, sometimes a military structure, on that artificial outcrop in the South China Sea. Are the Chinese claiming that then gives them a 12 nautical mile radius of sovereignty around an artificial structure? International law does not permit that. Therefore, America asserts that in pursuit of freedom of navigation, it's entitled to send its warships within that, I think it's a 9 nautical mile radius around these man-built structures, these artificial structures in the South China Sea. So America conducts so-called freedom of navigation patrols. So leave aside 9-dot line and that vague Chinese claim over the whole region, which no other power acknowledges or respects. There's a more specific concern about any claims the Chinese might be making to sovereignty, to legality within the radius of these artificial structures. The world doesn't accept that the international law of the sea permits China to make that claim around artificial structures as opposed to natural islands that they might legitimately claim ownership of. So America will continue to run freedom of navigation patrols that challenges that. They will send their warships into that radius around these artificial structures. The Chinese are likely to warn them to depart and to say, these are Chinese waterways. And both sides will conduct this pantomime and no one will come to grief.
So on the whole, you seem to be quite optimistic that both regarding Taiwan and regarding the South China Sea, no accidents will occur. Both sides will be careful and they will basically manage their problems and disagreements. Are you not too optimistic here that it couldn't explode?
Klaus, I'm quickly moving to say I'm not confident, but on the South China Sea, these American freedom of navigation patrols have been conducted now for some time. Both sides have managed them. America, as I understand it, gives the Chinese warnings that they're conducting these patrols. And there may be a capacity for both sides to manage any possibility of a mistake. I'm far less confident about Taiwan. Someone in Australia speculating about this the other day said, we may be moving into a period when there's a 50% chance of war. Are there enough off-ramps? That's a useful expression here, I think. Are there enough off-ramps between a clash, perhaps a misjudgment by one side or the other over the status of forces in the Taiwan Strait? Are there enough off-ramps and a readiness to take them and manage any resultant loss of face? Now, I wouldn't say I'm confident. I think this is the biggest diplomatic challenge in the day-to-day management of the U.S. China relationship.
Thank you. Are you aware if there's something like a red telephone line between Beijing and Washington, as there used to be between the Kremlin and the Oval Office?
I seem to recall some work on this in respect of the South China Sea. The fact that there hasn't been a showdown gives me some confidence that it's in place.
Okay, let's hope so. Can we move on to the role of Europe and Russia and also the UK now, with the UK having left the European Union? Do you see Europe and Russia really as used to be at the end of the Second World War, that all the Europeans, the UK, were the junior partners to either the United States or the Soviet Union, and now the junior partner to perhaps China and to the United States? Or does Europe and the UK and Russia still play a bit of a more independent power role?
Just think about Europe in this way. Europe is a source of the world's values on human rights. Europe, given its own experience at disastrous wars over 3 or 4 centuries, from the times of the 30 Years' War and the wars of religion, Europe is a good source of peacekeeping instincts and practices, of diplomacy. Europe is also the most important contributor, the most forward-leaning contributor to action on global climate change, at least until the election of the Biden team. Europe as an important source of vital global values is a concept I'd like to introduce to our audience. And I think it's been overlooked. And I think Europeans very often behave as if this is not the case. But I remember thinking at the time when we had the George W. Bush presidency and unilateral action, the invasion of Iraq, for example, the US then walking out of the Kyoto Protocol, not interested in serious action on climate change. I thought then that Europe demonstrated leadership. Schroeder, Chirac, the German and French leaders of the time. Europe is a source of human rights, values on human rights, environmental protection, preeminently climate change, and of an approach to peacekeeping and diplomacy. We should value that. For example, when Russia meets resistance to domestic repression, Navalny, this brave dissident, being treated with such a heavy hand as he has been over 20 years, it's what Europe says that has got most resonance. Certainly during the Trump presidency, Europe was the source of resistance and a voice on human rights. And I think that's true today when it comes to a response to the military coup in Myanmar. So Europe is a source, an important source of the values of the Western world. I'd underline that. I think a recent decision by the European Union to pursue an investment treaty with China sends a strong message about something else. And that is that Europe wasn't waiting for a coordinated position with the new administration in Washington. But clearly the European leadership wanted to say, we're putting the interests of our exporters before any coordination of China policy with Washington, and we're going to get in there even while Biden prepares to take over the presidency and settle an investment treaty with Beijing. And I thought that sent an important message about Europe's desire to manage its own relationship with China and not relegate that to Washington. I'm certain Jake Sullivan and Kurt Campbell were somewhat disappointed and haven't failed to pick up the message that Europe was sending by signing that agreement.
And what about the UK? Do you think the UK is still capable of playing an equally independent role in international politics as you believe the EU is capable of doing?
Well, it's very interesting. Boris Johnson's answer to that question is that when it comes to environmental policy, global policy on the climate, the UK is saying, regard us as global leader. Regard us as global leader. The first great diplomatic challenge for the UK out of the European Union is to manage global climate policy, simply because it is hosting the COPE summit in Glasgow at the end of the year. And what Boris Johnson has made clear to some of the UK's partners, including Australia, is that we expect you to approach this summit with fresh commitments on climate that go beyond your commitments under the Paris Agreement. That's caught Australia short, because I'm very sad to say that our national government is a laggard on climate. It's a prisoner of the carbon lobby. What Biden is doing is put it under enormous pressure, and what Boris Johnson is doing as well. Boris Johnson, to prove the continuing relevance of the United Kingdom after Brexit, needs to make this UN climate summit at the end of the year a triumphant success, with the nations of the world facing the prospect of 2-degree global warming by 2050, moving beyond, it's a very big step, the commitments on decarbonisation they made under the Paris Agreement. He can be enormously encouraged by what Japan, South Korea, and China have said. In the last months of last year, they made commitments about 2050, 2060 in the case of China, that are big breakthroughs. He'd be enormously encouraged with the corporate boardrooms around the planet are doing. They're moving beyond carbon. But this is the way climate diplomacy is, the way Britain proves its relevance. And again, the election of Biden is a great burst, sends a great burst of optimism and confidence that the world might rise to this challenge.
Mm-hmm. What about Australia and the UK? Will the Queen continue to be head of state of Australia, or do you think the Australians are going to ditch her soon?
Well, an American audience should bear this in mind. Australia, unlike you, had no declaration of independence. As a nation with a very small population, a European population concentrated in the southeast corner of this vast continent, when our colonies combined in 1901 to form the Commonwealth of Australia, with a constitution owing a lot to the American Constitution, we kept as our head of state Queen Victoria. So the monarch of the United Kingdom stayed the head of state. We didn't leave the British Empire. The British Empire left us. By losing Singapore to the Japanese in February 1942. That's a quirk in our constitution. The Australian people have been reluctant to change it. I tell you what, if in the next 10 years there were a referendum in Australia to change our constitution and to replace the Queen with an elected president, the people opposed to the change would win the day because they would use this one sentence argument: we don't want a Donald Trump. Don't put an elected president in our constitution because we might get one.
So Australia will get rid of the Queen or the British sovereign as head of state. The Scottish will go for independence. The Northern Irish will join the Republic of Ireland, and that leaves England and Wales. Is that the scenario you think will happen?
It's a very interesting one. Australia is a sovereign country, so it's deeply offensive to an Australian, Klaus, that you've lobbed us into the same category.
I certainly wouldn't dare to do that.
Wales and Scotland. And don't forget, Canada's in the same position. And Canada clings to the Queen more readily than we do because it's a way of distinguishing themselves from their big brother further south. But I think anyone with an interest in history is going to be fascinated by the prospect that this United Kingdom could be unraveling. And the essential argument is this: if we can all be part of a European Union, sharing sovereignty in that union, why do you need Westminster between Edinburgh and Brussels? Why do you need that level? Why shouldn't Scotland work on its direct relationship with Brussels and Northern Ireland as well?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, quite right. Before we move on, let me quickly ask a question about Vladimir Putin. You've met Putin, I think, at the G20 summit a number of years ago in St. Petersburg. What did you make of him? Did you like him as a person, and what do you make of his, defensive policies right now?
Well, he's enormously cunning. I'll never forget that evening, a long dinner in Peterhof, one of the grand palaces of the Tsars by the Baltic, in the G20 that he was hosting in 2013. President Obama quite ill-judged an uncharacteristic mistake from someone who's such a cool-headed, successful diplomat, had committed for discussion of the G20 the question of punitive strikes on Assad, the Syrian regime, for chemical weapons use during the Syrian civil war. And it was something on which America did not have support, not even from allies like Italy and Germany. And I saw Putin, who was chairing, as the host, chairing this G20, allow the debate to run. And over dinner, and at about midnight, wrap it up, he spoke last, and he only made two references as he concluded the debate, and we all went off back to our villas. He said, I want to quote two documents. One was the letter by the Pope saying that a punitive strike on Assad would not be a just war, declining to give an endorsement to punishment of the Assad regime for demonstrated chemical weapons use. And then Putin quoted the Pope, and of course that was an uncomfortable thing for Germany and Italy to contemplate, the Pope being invoked as an argument against what the US president was seeking. And secondly, he quoted a speech. He said, I want to quote a speech that a US senator gave, a candidate for the US Senate gave some years ago, opposing another military adventure in the Middle East. And he was quoting a speech that Obama had given as a Senate candidate, opposing Bush's policy in Iraq. He didn't say Obama, but he allowed it to stand, and every leader around that table knew what he was doing. It was a very deft. It was done with such a light touch. It displayed a diplomatic, rhetorical subtlety about the Putin style. But we've got to remember that this is someone who was drawn to a career in the KGB by a TV series that rendered glamorous Russian spy work. As a young man, he chose this for his career, had no other, and then entered the turbulent world of post-1989, early 1990s Russian politics, becoming deputy mayor to a powerful political figure in Petersburg. But by a sheer fluke, he was promoted by Yeltsin. I think he's guided by two figures in Russian history. One is the autocratic reactionary Tsar, Alexander III, the father of the last Tsar. Autocratic, yes, reactionary, yes, but he maintained the peace. He didn't risk his power by plunging into any unnecessary wars. And a figure who'd be known to students of Russian history, not to too many others, and that's Stolypin, who was as a prime minister under the last Tsar, attempting to guide Russia to a constitutional monarchy, but with a parliament that was like the Prussian parliament, pre-1914, pre-1918, beholden to the state, subsidiary to the state, the power of the state. He wanted a powerful Russian state. And in a broader sense, Putin is beholden to another figure in Russian history, which is Peter the Great, who claimed great slabs of additional territory to add to the Russian Empire. And Putin would think that he's historically vindicated by the boldness of his action in Ukraine, and pressing the boundaries of behaviour to make further territorial gains. But I think having, given the realpolitik that is part of his nature, having to calculate that the level of Western resistance is now substantial. And I think that's true with the election of Biden. I don't think he would be silly enough to think that Biden's a pushover.
And what about the domestic protest? Do you think that endangers his rule, that Putin essentially is domestically on the way out because his popularity has plummeted? So of course he's still in charge of a very strong police state. How do you see his future?
I think that there would be political pressure on him to rebuild that popularity. He's got limited budgetary opportunities to do that, given the straitened circumstances of the Russian economy. But there's only one way he can leave his position of power, and that's feet first. A peaceful transfer is very hard to contemplate because of the legal action, the international legal action that would be directed at Putin out of the presidency. So for him to surrender power would be for him, for all his personal wealth, to contemplate the rest of his life facing various jurisdictions and various very serious legal charges for human rights abuses. And I don't think he can contemplate that. I don't think he has a peaceful exit before him. I don't think he can surrender power.
I think many people would agree with that. Let's move to the Middle East. Do you think these Abraham Accords, which were concluded by the Trump administration, which many people say was basically almost the only foreign policy victory and success of the Trump administration? My question, were they a victory? Were they a positive development? And can the future of the Middle East, including the Palestinian issue, be built on these accords?
I think they've got to be seen as a diplomatic achievement of the Trump years to gain additional Arab states as signatories to an understanding with Israel in exchange for the government of Israel not annexing the West Bank is diplomacy. I think America will now be exercised in discussing, American diplomats under Biden, in discussing how you can bolt on, how you can retrofit the Abraham Accords with a revival of the two-state solution, so that at the end of it, you've got not just an empty promise by Israel not to annex the West Bank, but a commitment not to continue to roll out settlements on this occupied land, and a commitment to establish, subject to security guarantees for Israel, which are easily delivered, an independent, contiguous Palestinian state. That's what the Accords lack. The prospect of the Palestinian people at the end of the day will have the opportunity for a viable state of their own, living alongside the state of Israel and in peace with it, and with Europeans and other partners able to invest in it and make it a showcase for Palestinian creativity, a prosperous state and a democratic one. So I think that ideal will motivate diplomats in the Biden team who want that concept so familiar from the diplomacy of the Obama and the Clinton years, and all earlier American administrations, Republican as much as Democrats, a two-state solution with a Palestinian entity in agreed borders created by land swaps between mutually satisfactory land swaps between Israel and Palestine. My involvement in this, in the little arena of Australian politics, which has got no great bearing at all on what actually happens in the Middle East, has been to pull us away from an ironclad identification with Israel and to have Australian diplomats begin to talk about a Palestinian state. I was able to change the position of my own party, which is now in opposition in Canberra, but at least get us saying at the end of this, we want an independent Palestinian state, and if we come to government, we'll recognise one. I think that's a challenge for the Europeans, for European diplomacy. Are they prepared to move with Biden and a little bit ahead of Biden by saying, perhaps under a new Palestinian leadership, we will follow the example of Sweden and give recognition to Palestine?
Mm-hmm. What about Iran and Saudi Arabia? Apart from the Israel-Palestine issues, that power battle between Iran and Saudi Arabia, that seems to be the dominating issue, which has also pulled the outside powers, including the United States, into the Middle East even further and on certain sites in that conflict between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Can that conflict be resolved? Is there a way for peaceful coexistence between these countries?
The position for Washington is whether or how quickly to move from that comprehensive Trump-era identification of American power with the interests of the Saudi kingdom towards a position that was implemented by the Obama administration of something approaching neutrality between the Iranian and Saudi rivalry. And that position will be defined by the American diplomacy that seeks to revive the Iran nuclear deal. That was the biggest diplomatic challenge, of course, for Obama and his second Secretary of State, John Kerry. And it's going to absorb a lot of the time of the new Secretary of State, Antony Blinken. A huge challenge for America, and one that would be a triumph for Biden if he can persuade the Iranians to embrace it.
Are you optimistic?
Well, the resources including the intellectual resources of American power at its best, are considerable. Iran surely, as a regime, needs to confront the disaffection of its people over their impoverishment. The voice of the street in Tehran has got to be, forget your grand international adventures, you people in the leadership of the Revolutionary Guard. We want food. We want a currency that has got a bit of weight again. Let's get rid of these sanctions. Let's look after ourselves. No more adventuring. If that domestic pressure is as I think it is, the Iranian leadership should be entering negotiations very seriously with this new administration.
Let me ask you a final question before we open it up to questions from the audience. Recently, democracy has been quite challenged, even in the United States. Think of the insurrection at the Capitol. We have the looming Trump impeachment trial in the Senate, but also when you look recently only the coup in Myanmar, then we have a military government in Thailand, which doesn't seem to be moving towards democracy. You even have problems in Europe, in Hungary and Poland. The development seems to be away from democracy rather than embracing democracy. So is democracy doomed? Is the future really an autocratic government as we see it in China or Russia, rather than, the old liberal democratic systems we have all become used to?
Myanmar is the most recent of these tragedies, of course. I remember when I was foreign minister, that the beautiful bit of advice that the Indonesian president of the day, President Yudhoyono, gave the then military leadership of Myanmar. He said, listen to me, I'm a military officer, but I came to power through a democratic election. He said, I've taken my chances with democracy in Indonesia. The role of the army is in the barracks. So that was advice from one leader of Southeast Asia, a country that's a proud democracy, that has freedom of expression, where the army that once held political power retreated to the barracks, Indonesia. Advice to a country where the army was still holding power. And the tragedy is that I thought at the time, with Aung San Suu Kyi leading a democratic revival in Myanmar, we'd never see anything as reactionary, as retrograde, as dated, as an old-fashioned military coup. And that is what we are now witnessing. So, Klaus, you're right to ask this question. Thailand presents an equally sorry picture. How many times have we expressed the hope that this time Thailand would be firmly on the democratic path with the civilian government? To see Poland and Hungary move beyond any description of liberal democracy into another category, I suppose illiberal democracy or illiberal majoritarian system might be the best descriptor, is also very sobering. We Democrats have just got to work harder at making sure we're demonstrating to the world, preeminently in Washington, preeminently in the United States, that comprehensive freedom of expression and allowing the people to rule at the ballot box is compatible with beating the pandemic and delivering a solution to climate change and having domestic, social and racial justice.
Should we have that trial in the Senate of former President Trump, or should we not? Will it divide the country?
That's a matter for the American public. As a friend of the United States, I'd stop short of expressing a view on that. That is purely domestic affairs. I think for his part, the new president has been very diplomatic. He hasn't sent a message of vengefulness or partisanship. He's left it to Democrats in the Congress. What I got to say is again, to friends of America, very disturbing, is the polling that shows such a high percentage of Republican voters believing the election was stolen. I mean, that's like a big injection of poison into the American body politic, that 70, 80% of people who voted Republican in November could hold this view, this conspiracy view that the election had been won by Trump, but stolen by a Democrat conspiracy. Now that must make us all very concerned about the future of US democracy in the US. Perhaps it's best not to think of America as a democracy, but as a republic with proudly entrenched freedom of expression and a lively contest of power within the capital. Harder these days to see America as a leader of a world democratic movement. I'm being a bit provocative here, but to position itself as a leader of freedom of expression is much more convincing given the guarantees of the Constitution, but harder to say America is a democracy in the sense in which the Europeans or the Canadians and Australians are.
Thank you. And finally, what's the vaccine situation in Australia? Have people become vaccinated? There are not that many Australians compared to, let's say, the Chinese population, so they all should have been vaccinated by now.
So no, it seems we're last on the list because as a great island continent, we've been able to cut off access, to isolate ourselves. The position is pretty healthy here. It's under control, and the government is moving pretty slowly to reach out for vaccines. There is a bit of comfort that Australia has controlled this, but of course our great advantage is that we're an island and we're able to stop international entry. There are 60,000 Australians stranded overseas. They've been stranded overseas for months because the government very deliberately is not allowing them to get on flights home. And that's how we've kept the rate of infection way down, way down. That's been our key to managing this.
I guess that's one way of doing it. Thank you very much for your insights. Let's open it up to questions from the audience. Laurel, can I ask you, or Anna, can I ask you to ask the first question, please?
Absolutely. David Litt would like to know, should the Trans-Pacific Partnership be revived with the United States inside of it? And what should Australia's role in the TPP be?
Australia is in it, and we'd love America to be in it. Don't forget the Obama administration, when Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State, was saying our support for the TPP was a demonstration of our pivot or our rebalance, those were the two terms used, to Asia. So it was a demonstration of America's commitment to Asia to balance the rise of China. And then America under Trump says, we're not having anything to do with it. And Hillary, during the 2016 campaign, as a matter of fact, reconsidered, given the unpopularity of free trade, and said, no, I will not lead America into the TPP. Clearly, America is not ready to join, but America's got to consider that given its heroic role in negotiating the conditions of this TPP, which is very, very defensible, I should say, it is losing a lot in terms of regional leadership in not being part of it. America's got less credibility as a fully badged power in the Asia Pacific by not being with its partners like Japan and Australia and so many others in joining the TPP.
Thank you very much. Laurel, would you like to go ahead with the next question?
Sure. So Stuart Kaplan would like to know if there is an entente between China and Russia that we might see in the future, and if so, would Russia be content to be seen as the junior partner in this relationship?
I don't think Russia would. I don't think. You think of what I said about Putin earlier. The spirit of Peter the Great lives in his veins and is inspired by figures like Alexander III and Prime Minister Stolypin. It is not conceivable that he would allow he would allow Russia's role as a partner of China to be defined as subsidiary in any way. On both sides of that relationship, there are probably really serious reservations. I think it'd probably take something of a threat to Russia to see Russia sink further diplomatic and economic capital into its relationship with China. If you're looking for differences between the two, think about that long-standing Russian relationship with Vietnam. It's got a long history. And that's why Russia doesn't stand with China in the South China Sea. Its alignment is with Vietnam. I think it's Western action that will probably determine the level of future cooperation between the two. But it's worth exploring as students of history, there is a wariness between the two sides about appearing to merge their interests in any further degree.
Thank you. Anna, do you have another question?
I do. A lot of people have questions regarding Australia's relationship with China, specifically investment, but also how they're handling the coronavirus and Australia's views on that relationship.
Yep. Let me define my own position because I participated in this debate. I think Australia has displayed inept diplomacy in its relationship with China. Two issues stand out. One is the way in April last year, we appeared to stumble into arguing for an international inquiry into the origins and early management of the virus in Wuhan, China. It looked like we were pitching it as an anti-China gesture. It was more unfortunate still that our Prime Minister made this announcement after he'd had a conversation on the subject with Donald Trump, but before there'd been any diplomacy with China to say, look, we're moving in this direction. Can we talk about the terms of an inquiry? So it was. I think the general consensus in Australia is that we stumbled in our diplomacy on this. There would have been a smarter way of going about it. When it came to a decision 2 years earlier to exclude China from the Chinese company Huawei from providing the 5G network in Australia, we'd earlier made a decision that I'd defended under a different government to exclude Huawei from selling equipment for our broadband network. We went about the Huawei decision in 2018 in a pretty high-profile way. We didn't just say, as the Japanese and the New Zealanders did, at a bureaucratic level, that we weren't going to use Huawei technology. Australia let it be known that we were doing this after talking to the US again, and we positioned ourselves as a world leader, giving advice to other so-called Five Eyes nations, Canadians, for example, in the UK, that they should follow our path in excluding Huawei from our 5G. So as the Chinese saw it, we not only made this tough-minded decision to lock Huawei out, but we promoted it, our policy, as a model for the rest of the world. And we did it even before the US had made a decision. And again, a diplomatic touch was lacking. There are other examples as well, but the result is that we've appeared to be the most adversarial towards China of all America's allies. And we appear to have gone further at times even than the US. As a result, the Chinese have taken trade measures against Australia, putting us in a position where we will lose export markets in wine, in beef, in barley, in other products, and the US, under its phase one trade deal with China, will probably pick them up. So anti-China feeling is now running strongly in Australia, but there is an undercurrent of people saying did we have to inflict such harm on ourselves in getting to this position? Couldn't we have managed things a bit more subtly, rather like the New Zealanders, or a better example, a more substantial example, the Japanese?
Can you expand that into immigration into Australia? Asian immigration, but also general immigration. There have been tough laws which really make it almost impossible to come to Australia. Is that correct?
Oh no, Australia's got a very big immigration intake, or we did have before the pandemic hit, and it's overwhelmingly sourced from India and China. Australia is very multicultural, even more than the United States. A higher percentage of our population was born overseas, something like 35%. That's higher than in the US. We are an immigrant nation. What governments have done in recent years is to tackle the problem of people smuggling from ports in South Asia, bringing migrants in fishing vessels into Australian waters, and then saying to the Australian Navy, okay, it's your problem, process them on Australian soil. We now process such arrivals in Australian waters offshore and settle people who win a refugee status, not on Australian soil, but offshore in Papua New Guinea. And that was pretty tough, but it did reduce the flow of so-called boat people, enabling the Australian government to increase its regular refugee intake.
Australian universities, as far as I know, are highly dependent on particularly Chinese students. Is that going to be the future formula, or is the government trying to do something to change that situation?
The government's looking very seriously at diversification, but a middle-class Chinese family looking at options for a good university education finds Australia pretty attractive. It's probably more competitive in price terms with the United States, given the values of our currencies, and a pretty safe and attractive climate for Chinese students. It's been a fabulous source of income for Australian universities, but they've lost about 25% of their revenue because Chinese students can't get into Australia given the lockdown.
Mm-hmm. But that will change to the former position once we all can travel again?
Well, it's very hard. University places go where the demand is, and overwhelmingly, given China's transition to being a middle-class society, it is the biggest market for places at Australian universities. And here's part of the challenge that America faces with China. America is challenging China. America is accepting competition with China. But China is in the process of hauling hundreds of millions of people into additional people into middle income status. It's providing the demand. The countries of Asia are pumping exports into China because of this huge economic transformation that's ploughing ahead. Between 2012 and 2030, according to OECD calculations, China's adding 850 million people to its middle class. And in 2021, it is, despite the setback of the pandemic, it's absolutely on target. As America, under Blinken, under Kurt Campbell, talks to its friends in Asia, it's got to acknowledge that they, including Australia, are hugely dependent on something happening just over the horizon. That is the continued growth of the Chinese economy as China moves towards its great economic goal. The dynamism of the Chinese economy is the biggest economic fact of life on this planet. And that's a restraint on the extent to which America can recruit countries in Asia for a sort of informal alliance to resist China. When Australia's 46% of everything Australia exports goes to one market, that's China. And we can talk about diversification, but you're not seeing anything to replace it in India or Indonesia. The economic dynamism is a triumph of, whether we like it or not, of this one-party Chinese state. And I think it's important that I underline that as we near the end of our exchange, because it is a factor that is the challenge of Chinese competition that Washington is now responding to.
So economic disengagement is simply not possible. Is that what you're saying?
No, we all say that. The notion of decoupling from China is not real, and America has hurt itself when Trump has tried to do that through tariffs. It's hurt American farmers, and it's hurt, not helped, employment in the US steel industry. Nonetheless, there is a strong case to be made on intellectual property and on technological competition that invites a different policy than on China, than the one that prevailed in the Obama and Bush years, for example, simply because China is so much more formidable.
Yeah, thank you. Laurel, would you ask the next question, please?
Sure. Jess Matthews would like to know if, given the attack on the Capitol back in January, if you think the Biden administration has the capacity to restore trust in the United States and our democracy.
I think we've all got to calculate that the Trump forces have not been routed in the United States. I think in every foreign ministry around the world, the calculation will be being made that Trump forces could be back there in a majority position in the Senate and in the House as early as 2022. There could be a Trump presidency emerging in 2024, Trump himself or a candidate he's endorsed. I think Friends of America are looking not only at what happened on January 6, but at what the Republican Party is doing and saying in Arizona, in Oregon, expressions of loyalty to Trump. In the Congress, a remarkable level of support for Trump continues to be expressed by Republicans. The Republican Party is not giving any signs that it's broken with this Bonapartist leader who had remarkable control of the party for the last 4 years. And I think the world's got to calculate that. If there are mistakes made by the Democrats and a revival in the position of Republicans, then America's friends will be calculating that Democrat dominance in the Capitol could be short-lived, and we might be dealing again with a more predictable, populist, authoritarian United States with a transactional foreign policy directed at its allies. No one can overlook that possibility. That's the way I put it.
Thank you very much, Anna.
Jordan would like to know how you feel about the interconnection of climate change and capitalism, and how you think it will affect the future international political and social landscape.
Right now, I'm thinking that the most hopeful signs on climate have come from the business sector, because driven by the laws of capitalism, it's calculating risks to profit in the years ahead, and concluding that further investment in carbon is going to be high risk for its investors and for its shareholders. I think you've seen at the start of last year, Blackstone, as a huge investment fund, make that decision. You've seen European and American energy companies say we're out of this. I mean, one of Biden's most welcome initiatives is to reinstate the controls of the Obama administration on the vehicle sector, This time round, the American vehicle industry is saying, we're moving anyway. We're making a move to electric vehicles. We're doing so because of market and profit considerations. So I think this is enormously encouraging. What might get the world to the necessary action on climate is business getting out of coal and gas, because there's now a US administration that's making it clear it's out of coal and gas, saying none of it will be used in the generation of American electricity by 2035. What capitalist outfit is going to invest in coal and gas, given that that's the direction Washington is saying it's going to take? So right now, in this phase of the struggle against the catastrophe, the emergency of climate, the private sector is an ally of reaching those Paris goals and even pressing beyond them. Beyond that, however, we have got a challenge, and that is whether the concept of endless economic growth is compatible with life on the planet. Are we going to continue to fill the oceans of the world with plastic, so that inside the guts of every maritime mammal or every seabird, like an albatross, inside their guts, you've got this product of the world's factories, plastic products. It's an enormously depressing measure of how our pursuit of growth, dictated by the rules of capitalism and indeed any other economic system that is being tried, is threatening the life on this planet that you, our audience, are going to be leading for the next 70 years or more.
Was it the right decision to stop the Keystone pipeline from Canada to the United States, which has been quite controversial?
Yes, and I mean, just one of those decisions that makes you want to cheer this new administration after the climate denialism of the last 4 years, this pig-ignorant rejection of the science of climate. To have a US president sitting there in the Oval Office saying, no, we take a different direction, is, combined with what the private boardrooms are doing, is just the most hopeful development. I find it hopeful, but for young people who are part of our discussion, Klaus, it means even that much more. Because if we move beyond that 2 degree warming, if we're really looking at 3 degrees warming in the second half of this century, it's going to be a degraded and compromised existence that humanity leads.
Thank you. Anna, would you ask the next question?
Yeah, could I actually ask a follow-up on that
Sure.
answer? I'm wondering, do you believe that market solutions are happening too slowly to adequately address climate change concerns, or do you think they can act substantially enough and quickly enough now to put us on a path that makes sense?
This is the most important question that you've put to me. I had a former executive of an oil and gas company in my office a few days ago. He studied this very carefully. He believes that the Paris targets are not getting us there fast enough because of some key tipping points we are now at. He says if you look, for example, at one of those tipping points, the release of methane into the atmosphere from disintegrating permafrost, for example, in America's Northwest, Canada's Northwest, and in Siberia, you're looking at something profoundly disturbing. Methane is pluming out of the disintegrating permafrost faster than anyone has calculated. You know that methane is far more destructive as a global warming instrument than carbon. The science is very open here. The science is unsettled. We don't know how more quickly that disintegration of the permafrost might be, and hence how much more methane might plume skyward. So this is a tipping point. This is something happening faster than was calculated in 2015 when we made certain assumptions about the Paris Agreement. We may not be acting fast enough. I think that Biden is probably as bold as it's possible to be, and by attempting to get coal out of the electricity network as fast as he's saying, and to expedite the shift to electric vehicles, is creating the possibility, if there's success on these fronts, with accelerating progress even further. I'm convinced that he and John Kerry are looking carefully at the science, and they would share the anxiety that lies behind this question. The fact that we might be failing to do enough to avoid catastrophic warming in the second half of the century.
Thank you very much. Maybe we should turn to Laurel for the next question.
Sure. David Litt would like to know, can Australia play a diplomatic role in the Gulf region in maintaining stability?
And I should add that David Litt is a former ambassador to the United Arab Emirates, so he has a particular great interest in that region in the Middle East.
Yeah, thank you, David. We've got a very good relationship with the UAE, as it happens. A lot of economic exchange, and they're investing big in Australia, and a deep level of cooperation on strategic matters. You'd probably be aware of that. I think Australia was quick to support, under Obama, the American commitment to broad action in Syria and Iraq to counter the rise of ISIS. We were very quick to lend trainers for the local military, to put planes and pilots in the skies over Iraq and Syria to support that broad-based American diplomacy led by American diplomat Brett McGurk, to assemble a coalition to back in the forces who were fighting ISIS. And I think that's an example of an Australian role. And it's one that I, as a former foreign minister, supported. We're probably, in my opinion, a bit too eager to commit a warship to the Gulf more recently, but nonetheless, we were there, and it was probably a not unreasonable alliance request by America to Australia.
Thank you. Anna, would you go ahead?
Yes. One moment, sorry. So there's a lot of questions about climate change. Again, this one, do you believe that an adequate solution to climate change would include population planning? Why or why not?
Absolutely. I think aid, overseas development assistance from countries, developed countries, Australia and the US, ought to be made dependent on the recipients giving support to women and girls in education, in rights generally, the rights of women and girls. This was a priority of Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State, and I was very happy to work with her on that, elevating the rights of women and girls in developing countries, because we know there is a direct link between conferring rights on women and girls and them making decisions to have smaller families, And our aid policies ought to be made dependent on women having the right to choose. Now that, I know that's a subject of debate with conservatives in the US and under the George W. Bush administration. I'm sure under Trump, the very opposite position was taken. But population policy, the surge in the world population is the biggest driver of environmental degradation. And all of us are hoping that more stability, a reduction in the rate of growth, is going to be achieved to assist us meet those beyond 2050 climate goals.
Thank you. Laurel.
Do you foresee countries like South Korea or Japan going nuclear in light of the America First policies that we've seen over the past 4 years?
No, I don't think so. And I think the most, beyond climate, one of the most important areas for American leadership, an area where America really is the indispensable nation, is in achieving nuclear non-proliferation. That's why I consider quite heroic the success of the Obama administration and then Secretary of State John Kerry in achieving that agreement with Iran, and why I consider its reinstatement so important. I think American leadership will allay any nervousness of South Korea and Japan about their exposure. And it's why the American treaty commitments to both countries is important in non-proliferation.
Thank you. Anna.
What do you believe the future prospects for Chinese campuses of American universities, such as Duke's Kushan University, are in light of cybersecurity, human rights concerns, and others?
I think it's vital that we protect diplomatic exchange. One of the most frightening features right now is the way academics who have taken for granted exchange with Chinese collaborators are now being demonized and prosecuted. We've got to resist that. We've got to have people-to-people exchanges. Biden said to me in that single meeting I had with him as vice president when I was foreign minister of my country, he said several times in our conversation, well, you Australians know so much about China. And he was saying it for a third time, and I interrupted him. And I said, no Western country has a deeper knowledge of China than the United States. Your contact with China goes back to the 1790s, when you're able to set out and trade with China because you're no longer banned from doing so by the dictates of the British Empire. And there's a wonderful book written about, some of you might have read it, about the first Chinese students who went to America for a university education. I think it might have been as early as the 1870s, 1880s. There's a wonderful record of American scholars. In Western writing about China, nothing beats American scholarship. American scholarship has guided my understanding of China on the bookshelves here at home and in my office. I've got the works of American scholars interpreting Chinese history. And to see that compromised in a China panic, a revival of Cold War attitudes, is tragic. Here is the challenge. We can protect ourselves from cyber warfare and intrusion. We can protect our intellectual property and still have a full-bodied academic exchange with Chinese scholars. If we don't, we're only hurting ourselves. Do we want to, if I just add this, do we really want to cut ourselves off from the prospect of a deeper understanding with one of the world's great civilizations, now in a process of revival? All of us in the West would be more comfortable if China were rebuilding itself under a political system that allowed contestability and was built on a constitutional commitment to freedom of speech, multi-party democracy. We'd all find that more comforting. But in the meantime, let's not prevent the exchanges and the research that enables us to understand better the phenomenon of Chinese culture. I want the opportunity to be able to do that. And yet I now fear that there will be less opportunity for me to talk in Australia to Chinese scholars because they're being kicked out by an overreaction and a panic. We've got to recognise a phenomenon that I've really taken to call China panic. The rise of China is taking place. It's based on economic fundamentals. It is taking place in a somewhat challenging way because of the nature of their political system. We nonetheless should react to that rise in a way that doesn't lapse into panic and hostility. And the sort of adversarial policy towards China that right now Australia has been pursuing.
Thank you. I think we would all like to agree with that. But let me ask you, there is a terrible situation in Xinjiang, and everyone really in the West deplores it, while China doesn't seem to understand our concerns. So what can we do about bridging that huge gulf? Is it public humiliation, which it really can't be? Is it secret diplomacy behind closed doors? Or how do we bring our concerns across so that they might have a persuasive impact?
I think there are a range of options here, and we should explore all of them. Certainly at the top of the agenda, when we have exchanges with our Chinese counterparts, and without projecting it through a megaphone, without splashing it in our media, we should be saying to our Chinese interlocutors, foreign minister to foreign minister, we have deep concerns about human rights. We believe that these human rights are universal rights, and we want to explore them with you. Here are the specifics that concern us right now about repression in Xinjiang province, and we want to explore them with you. We want to have a dialogue with you about them. We can home in on specific cases, people who might have, in your instance, American links. America's been very good over the years in nominating the cases of particular dissidents being mistreated in another country. That's a model for Australians to pursue as well, particular families. But also insisting on an engagement with Chinese leadership over the broad implementation of what Human Rights Watch has alerted to us as being a very repressive and indeed cruel regime directed at the Uyghur population. Well, I mean, one disadvantage about the state of Australia-China relations is that we can't get any dialogue with a counterpart in China, not prime minister to prime minister, foreign minister to foreign minister. And that means you can't have these exchanges. Now, the exchanges might be slow to produce a result, but in the context of a diverse relationship, they should figure big, and we are entitled, true to our values as Western countries, to pursue them with China. And yes, they're likely to be more likely to be responded to if we do it without projecting them, as I said, through a megaphone, making them instances of megaphone diplomacy, but gave the Chinese the opportunity to respond and modify policies without a large public loss of face.
Are you optimistic that it will happen?
No, I'm not naive. I'm not going to leave you with the impression that I'm naively upbeat about the chances of this working. But the alternative being to do nothing, we've got no alternative but to to act and to persist. And our best hope is that China believes its policies are unnecessary and unworthy of a country moving in to a position of leadership based on it having the world's biggest economy, which it will have shortly by the second of the two available measures. The world is seeking to send a message, without sounding condescending, that it expects better from China. One has got to note, however, between ourselves, that Islamic countries have been slow to raise concerns with China over what appears to us in the West to be a pretty repressive regime directed at the Uyghurs.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. We come to the end of our time, but we have a few questions left. If you bear with me, then I would like to ask for these questions to be read out. Whose turn was it? Was it Anna? I can't remember.
So you've talked a lot about the current relations between Australia and China. What do you see for Australia and China and their relationship long term?
Not too good, I'm sad to say. Like a fair number of Australians, I think our diplomacy has been poor. We could have been much smarter about managing our differences with China. And it's really tragic that a policy that applied from 1972, when we opened diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China, to 2017, that is, of serious engagement with China, has now been junked. And I think our inept diplomacy has been the biggest part of that failed bilateral relationship. And very, very sadly, I think we're looking at what could be 10 years of limited access between Australia and China. And I find myself asking, why, of all America's allies, has Australia got to be out in front, having the most adversarial towards China of all? More than Japan, South Korea, more than Canada, sometimes more than the US itself. I don't think it's in our national interest. I just unapologetically support a pragmatic, national interest-based policy of engagement between Australia and China without surrendering any of Australia's values and without in any way being neglectful of our alliance relationship so valuable to us with the United States.
Thank you. Laurel, please.
Last one in the queue right here is from Philip Blatt. He's asking about the Australian Open coming up in a few weeks. He wants to know how, having guests in to observe if that's a good idea given COVID these days.
Good question. I'm not up to date with it. I think it's going to be very carefully managed, and we'll be acutely embarrassed if there is any evidence that should suggest this has become a super spreader event. Our authorities are pretty conservative, though, and I don't think they're going to be taking any risk. It would blot our copybook pretty badly, because Australians are pretty proud of the way this has been managed. And the national government in Australia and the different state governments have got a fair bit of credit for their management of the crisis.
Thank you very much. Let me ask you a personal question toward the end of our show, so to speak. You resigned as foreign minister in late 2013. Then you embarked on a very active academic and writing and directorship of academic institutions career. What was the difference? Or weren't you kind of almost shocked by the difference to be pulled down from, let's say, meetings with Biden and Putin to mere academia?
I think one of the great things about a democracy, Klaus, well, Al Gore tells the story of having been vice president of the US, driving through the South somewhere and stopping in a diner and going into the diner and sitting there and having his pancakes. And someone, I think a family passing him, stopping and looking and saying, "Boy, you've come down to the world, haven't you?" I think it's a beautiful story about electoral democracy. The fact that there are lots of stories about US President Dwight Eisenhower going to the farm in Pennsylvania after occupying the White House. I don't think he had any security, or Harry Truman going home. I mean, it's a good thing when you cease to be a political leader. You hand in your commission and you walk out, no longer Premier Carr or Foreign Minister Carr, but I suppose to take the nomenclature of the French Revolution, Citizen Carr, just a citizen. It's a beautiful thing.
Did you feel liberated?
Yeah, somewhat liberated, proud of what one managed to do, defensive when you hear your record criticised, but just very happy to be able, it's a very Australian thing, very Sydney thing, to be able to stroll down to the beach and plunge into the surf, and there with your head above the waves, have some swimmer recognise you and say, "How are you? Good to see you here. Good. I think you did a good job." That's a transition that is very precious in a democracy. You recognise it in the US, and a leader one day and just a citizen the next. It's terrific.
And we are all very envious that you can actually stroll down to the beach. What are your plans for the future? Do you want to write another book, or what other plans do you have?
I share this with the audience, Klaus. There's one issue before us all, and that's climate. The evidence is very disturbing. I say to the young people there, this is your planet. It's the only planet. We're not going to be settling others. The race is really on to get policies in place that are going to prevent warming beyond a catastrophic level. Look at the data, look at those tipping points, encourage. I think the battle is to encourage people on the conservative side of politics, people in the US Republican Party, to come up with bold conservative solutions to climate. That's what I want to hear. I want to see people who support capitalism, who are on the conservative side, conservative views on all the litmus issues, but who will say this is a matter of science and we've got to use market forces to see that we keep warming under 1.5 degrees.
Thank you. I'm sure you will do your bit to get us there. We will all try to help. And thank you very much for talking to us tonight, for giving us your insights, for answering all our many questions. It was a pleasure to see you here at the Krasno Global Event Series. And we talked about in the past, eventually I hope you will be able to make it actually to Chapel Hill, so that we can all see you live, and we'll perhaps have a bit of a conference about climate change, about Chinese-Western relations and many other pressing issues, which we will then have you live and enjoy the occasion to actually go for a drink and have dinner afterwards, which I would love to do tonight, but unfortunately Zoom isn't quite as well advanced to facilitate that. Bob Carr, thank you very much indeed for joining us tonight. Our next event will be on February the 17th. That is an event about Germany in the post-Merkel period. And we are asking the question, will Germany become more unpredictable, or what is going to happen with that country once Angela Merkel has left the stage in later this year? For tonight, I would like to thank once again Bob Carr for joining us. I would like to thank Anna and Laurel for asking and moderating the questions so well. And of course, I would like to thank all of you for watching us, for being such loyal and good supporters of the Krasno event series here at Chapel Hill. And I look forward to seeing you in mid-February, 17th of February, here again. Thank you very much, and good night to all of you.
Thank you, Klaus. Thank you.
Thank you. It was a great pleasure. It was great.
Thank you, Klaus.
Bye-bye.